The night had settled over London like a velvet blanket. Heathrow Airport buzzed with the controlled chaos that defined international travel. The rhythmic clatter of luggage wheels on polished floors. The steady drone of announcements echoing through vast terminals. The murmur of thousands of voices blending into a symphony of human movement. Families reunited with tears and laughter. Business travelers rushed past with determined strides. Children pressed their faces against enormous windows, watching planes ascend into the darkness like mechanical birds seeking the stars. In the midst of this perpetual motion, one man moved with a different quality entirely. His steps were measured, unhurried. His presence commanded attention not through ostentation, but through an indefinable dignity that seemed to emanate from within. He wore a simple khaki shirt, its top button fastened, paired with ordinary black trousers and well-worn shoes. In his hand, he carried a single modest bag. No entourage. No security detail, no photographers jostling for position. This was Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. But tonight, in this crowded airport, he was simply another traveler. Traoré had always believed in this practice, to occasionally shed the trappings of power and walk among ordinary people as one of them. It was his philosophy that true leadership required understanding life from ground level, not from the insulated heights of presidential palaces. When people call you Mr. President, he often reflected, they show you only what they think you want to see. But when they see you as just another human being, they reveal the truth. As he joined the queue at check-in, the airline staff processed his ticket without fanfare. Economy class, though it had been modestly upgraded to business class at the gate. Not for comfort, but as part of his ongoing social experiment. He wanted to observe whether people in premium sections received the basic courtesy extended to all humans, or if something more sinister lurked beneath the surface of civilized air travel. In his mind, a philosophical question had taken root. When power is concealed, how do the faces of the world change? What masks do people wear and which ones do they remove? The security checkpoint passed without incident. He moved through the standard procedures with the same patience as everyone else, his passport bearing the golden seal, President of Burkina Faso, tucked discreetly in his pocket. That seal was a responsibility, he believed, not a badge of superiority to be flaunted. As he approached the departure gate, the airport's diverse humanity unfolded before him. A European family with children running in circles, the mother's exasperated voice cutting through the ambient noise. A young businessman pacing back and forth, phone pressed to his ear, his conversation growing increasingly agitated. Elderly couples sitting silently, hands intertwined, their comfort with each other speaking louder than words. Traoré found a seat near the window and settled in, closing his eyes. The cacophony of the airport faded into background noise as he centered himself. His mother's voice, as it often did in moments of reflection, echoed in his memory. Son, the true test of power comes when nobody recognizes you. If you can maintain justice and integrity in that moment, when you're anonymous, then you are a true leader. A gentle smile crossed his face. He whispered a prayer under his breath. God, grant me the wisdom to wield power without arrogance, to lead with humility, and to see every person as equal in your eyes. The boarding announcement crackled through the speakers, pulling him back to the present. He stood gracefully, joined the queue, and moved toward the gate with the steady flow of passengers. The flight attendant scanned his ticket and offered a professional smile. Enjoy your flight, sir? Thank you, Traoré replied warmly. That's all I ask for, a peaceful journey. As he stepped into the aircraft, he was greeted by that distinctive airplane smell, a mixture of recycled air, coffee, cleaning products, and the subtle must of well-used carpeting. He located his seat in the business class cabin, second row, window side. The seat was comfortable, spacious even. But Traoré sat upright as was his habit, fastened his seatbelt, and turned his gaze to the window. Outside, the runway lights stretched into the distance like a luminous pathway to the heavens. The great machine that would carry them through the sky hummed and vibrated with barely contained energy. Traoré did not know that within minutes, His quiet journey would transform into something extraordinary. A storm was gathering, not in the skies above, but in the hearts and minds of those around him. A moment was approaching that would test not only his patience and dignity, but would ultimately send ripples across the entire world. He closed his eyes once more, breathing deeply, centering himself in that place of inner peace he had cultivated over decades of service and struggle. Outside, the wind began to pick up. Inside, he found stillness. The engines roared to life. The plane began its taxi toward the runway, and Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, sat in quiet contemplation, unaware that he was about to teach the world a lesson it desperately needed to learn. That respect has no color, dignity knows no rank, and true power lies not in domination, but in restraint. The aircraft climbed steadily through the London night, breaking through layers of clouds until the lights of the city below became distant pinpricks, then vanished entirely into darkness. Inside the business-class cabin, a comfortable routine had settled over the passengers. Some worked on laptops, their faces illuminated by blue-white screens. Others read books or magazines, sipped wine, or simply reclined with eyes closed, surrendering to the gentle rumble of the engines. The atmosphere was one of privileged tranquility, the kind of peace that money can buy, at least temporarily. Then that peace shattered like crystal against stone. "Excuse me?" A voice rang out, sharp and imperious, cutting through the cabin's quietude with the precision of a knife. Every head turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the flight attendants paused in their duties, sensing immediately that something was wrong. The voice belonged to a woman named Margaret Dunson. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed in designer clothing that practically announced her wealth. Gold jewelry adorned her wrists and neck. Not tasteful accents, but ostentatious displays of affluence. Her face, surgically maintained to defy time, wore an expression of indignation that suggested she was unaccustomed to being challenged about anything. Margaret was a European businesswoman who had built a career on being ruthless, direct and utterly convinced of her own superiority. Her sense of entitlement was as heavy as her expensive handbag, and twice as difficult to ignore. She gestured dramatically toward Ibrahim Traoré, who sat peacefully in his seat, a cup of tea resting on his tray table, his eyes gazing contemplatively out the window. "Who allowed him to sit here?" Margaret demanded, her voice dripping with disdain. The flight attendant, a young woman named Lena, approached with professional composure despite the obvious tension. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" "Problem." Margaret's laugh was brittle and cold. "This section is for executive passengers only." "Look at him." She waved her hand dismissively in Traoré's direction. "He doesn't even belong here. This is business class, not some charity program." An uncomfortable ripple moved through the cabin. Several passengers shifted in their seats. Some looked away, unwilling to engage. Others stared, curious about how this scene would unfold. Lena maintained her professional demeanor, though a flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks. "Ma'am, he is a business-class passenger. His ticket is completely valid." "Valid?" Margaret's voice rose another notch. "Oh, please. He probably got it by mistake, or on some kind of promotional upgrade. I mean, just look at his clothes." She gestured toward Traoré's simple khaki shirt. "This is unacceptable. I paid a premium to be here, and I don't expect to spend 8 hours sitting next to someone who clearly doesn't belong in this section." Throughout this verbal assault, Ibrahim Traoré had not moved. His face remained serene, betraying no emotion. Not anger, not embarrassment, not even acknowledgement. He simply continued to gaze out the window as if he were alone with his thoughts, floating above the petty concerns of the world. But inside, he was fully aware. Every word registered. Every insult landed. Yet he chose silence, that powerful weapon that so few understand how to wield. Margaret's tirade continued, growing more aggressive with each passing moment. "Listen, I don't want to make a scene, but I have standards. I didn't work my entire life to build my business just to sit next to someone like this." She paused, searching for words that would express her contempt without being overtly explicit, though her meaning was crystal clear. Lena tried once more to diffuse the situation. "Ma'am, please. Everyone in this cabin has paid for their seat. There's no issue here except, don't lecture me about issues, Margaret interrupted. I know how these things work. Airlines let certain people upgrade for free these days, just to look inclusive. Well, I didn't sign up for that kind of social experiment on my flight. That last sentence hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating the entire cabin. Several passengers looked visibly uncomfortable now. A Japanese businessman in the row ahead closed his eyes and shook his head slightly. An African student in the back row clenched his fists, his jaw tight with anger. But still, Ibrahim Traoré said nothing. Lena's hands trembled slightly as she tried once more. Ma'am, I really must ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing other passengers, and I'll lower my voice when someone addresses my legitimate concern, Margaret shot back. Then she turned directly to face Traoré, her voice laden with contempt. You. Yes, you. Do you even understand what I'm saying? Do you speak English? At this, Ibrahim Traoré finally moved. Slowly, with deliberate grace, he set down his teacup. He turned his head to look at Margaret, and for the first time she found herself meeting his gaze directly. What she saw there made her falter just for a moment. His eyes held no anger, no shame, no fear. Instead, they contained something far more powerful, a deep, abiding certainty. The eyes of a man who had nothing to prove because he knew exactly who he was. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, and carried an authority that had nothing to do with volume. Madam, he said in perfect English, his accent slight but his words precisely chosen. If respect were measured by skin color, the earth would tower over the sky. But it does not, and neither should you tower over anyone here. The words were simple, almost poetic, but they landed like a thunderclap. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. For a brief moment, she seemed at a loss for words, a rare occurrence, clearly. Then her face hardened, pride and embarrassment mixing into a toxic combination. Really, she managed, her voice now uncertain despite her attempt at bravado. And who exactly do you think you are to speak to me like that? Traoré's expression did not change. I am someone who is showing you a reflection of your own behavior. Sometimes we cannot see ourselves clearly until someone holds up a mirror. A mirror? Margaret laughed, but the sound was hollow. You're going to give me life lessons? You in your thrift store shirt? The value of wisdom, Traoré replied calmly, is not diminished by the simplicity of its wrapping. By now, the entire business-class cabin had fallen into absolute silence. Even the flight attendants stood frozen, unsure how to proceed. This was not a situation covered in their training manuals. A passenger being verbally assaulted for his appearance, defending himself with quiet dignity while his attacker grew increasingly unhinged. Margaret stood up abruptly, her voice reaching a crescendo. I want him moved. Downgrade him to economy class where he belongs, or I'm getting off this plane. This is absolutely unacceptable. Lena looked desperately toward the front of the cabin, where the chief flight attendant had emerged from the cockpit area, alerted by the commotion. The chief attendant, a woman in her 40s named Claire, approached quickly. What seems to be the problem here? Claire asked, her voice carrying the weight of authority. Margaret whirled to face her. The problem is that your airline has seated me next to someone who clearly doesn't belong in business class. Look at him. He's probably never even flown before. This is discrimination against paying customers like me. Claire glanced at Traoré, who remained seated calmly, then back at Margaret. Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice and return to your seat. All passengers in this cabin have valid tickets, and I don't care about tickets. Margaret's voice cracked with emotion now, though whether from anger or something else was unclear. I care about standards. I care about knowing that when I pay premium prices, I get a premium experience. And that doesn't include sitting next to someone who looks like he just wandered in off the street. The racism implicit in her words was now explicit, undeniable. Several passengers gasped. One woman in the back covered her mouth with her hand. Horrified, and still, Ibrahim Traoré sat in perfect stillness, like the eye of a hurricane, calm at the center of chaos. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket. With slow, deliberate movements, he withdrew his passport. He held it in his hands for a moment, looking down at it as if contemplating a great weight, a tremendous responsibility encoded in those pages. Then he looked up at Margaret, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet sadness that was somehow more devastating than anger could ever be. "You have a problem, madam," he said softly. "But it is not with me. It is not even with my clothes or my skin. Your problem is with yourself, with the darkness in your own heart that blinds you to the light in others." He paused, letting the words settle over the cabin like snow. "I could tell you who I am. I could show you credentials that would make you apologize. But that would solve nothing. Because tomorrow, you will meet another person you judge unworthy, and you will treat them the same way because you have not learned the lesson. You have only learned fear of consequences." Margaret's face had gone pale. Something in his tone, in the weight of his words, had penetrated her armor of privilege and pride. "The real question," Traoré continued, his voice gentle now, almost tender, "is not who I am. The question is, who do you want to be? Because right now, in this moment, you are showing everyone here exactly who you are, and it is not beautiful." The silence that followed was profound, heavy with meaning. It was the kind of silence that occurs when truth has been spoken so clearly that no response is possible. Claire, the chief flight attendant, stood frozen, her training suddenly seeming inadequate for this moment of raw human drama playing out at 35,000 feet. Then, quietly, Traoré extended his passport toward Lena. "Perhaps," he said with infinite patience, "this will help clarify matters. Not to shame anyone, but simply to illuminate the truth that we are all equal in the eyes of God, regardless of the offices we hold or the clothes we wear." Lena took the passport with trembling hands. She opened it, her eyes scanning the first page, then the second. And then she saw it, the golden seal, the official designation, the diplomatic stamps that left no doubt, President of the Republic of Burkina Faso. The passport slipped from her fingers, though she caught it before it fell. Her face drained of color. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Margaret, seeing Lena's reaction, felt the first real tremor of doubt. What is it?" Lena looked up, her voice barely a whisper. He's the president of Burkina Faso." The words hung in the air like a detonation suspended in time, its shock wave about to break over them all. Margaret's face underwent a transformation, from confusion to disbelief to dawning horror as the implications cascaded through her mind. The comfortable certainties of her worldview were crumbling, and she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. And Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, simply sat in his seat, his expression unchanged, his dignity intact, and waited quietly for the lesson to take root. Time seemed to stop in the aircraft cabin. The revelation hung in the air like a bell that had been struck, its reverberations spreading through every heart and mind present. Margaret Dunson stood frozen, her hand halfway to her mouth, her carefully constructed facade of superiority crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to flame. The color drained from her face, leaving her complexion ashen beneath her makeup. The president?" she stammered, her voice now stripped of its earlier imperious tone. That can't be." But even as she spoke, she could see the truth in the faces around her. Claire, the chief flight attendant, had moved forward and was now examining the passport herself, her professional composure barely masking her shock. Other flight attendants had gathered nearby, whispering urgently among themselves. From the cockpit, Captain Michael Reynolds emerged, having been informed of the situation. He was a veteran pilot with 30 years of experience, a man who had seen nearly everything that could happen on an aircraft. But this was unprecedented. He approached Traoré's seat, his face a mixture of mortification and respect. "Your Excellency," he said, his voice carrying through the now silent cabin, "I had no idea you were aboard. We received no notification from the booking system. Please accept my profound apologies for this situation." Traoré regarded him with calm eyes. "Captain, you have nothing to apologize for. You did not create this situation. You merely inherited it. The question is not about protocol or notification. The question is about how we treat one another when titles and positions are stripped away." He turned his gaze back to Margaret, who had sunk into her seat, her hands covering her face. Madam, you judged me based on my appearance, my clothing, the color of my skin. You decided, without knowing anything about me, that I was less than you. Tell me, does knowing my title change who I am? Does it change the person I was 5 minutes ago? Margaret's hands fell from her face, revealing tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I had no idea. Exactly, Traoré interrupted gently. You had no idea. But should that have mattered? Should my humanity, my right to basic respect and dignity, depend on my position or title? Is a president more deserving of courtesy than a farmer, a teacher, or a street cleaner? The cabin remained silent, every passenger riveted by this extraordinary scene. Several people had their phones out recording, though Traoré seemed not to notice or care. He continued, his voice steady and clear, each word chosen with precision. I am the president of Burkina Faso, yes. But that is what I do, not who I am. I am first and foremost a human being. A son, a father, a brother. I have known hunger and hardship. I have felt pain and loss. I have experienced joy and love. These things make me human. Not my title, not my office, not the seal on my passport. He stood now, not aggressively, but with a quiet authority that commanded attention. He was not tall, but in that moment, he seemed to fill the space with his presence. When I chose to fly without security, without announcement, without the trappings of power, it was not an oversight. It was a choice. I wanted to experience what millions of my fellow Africans, my fellow humans, experience every day. The casual racism, the assumption of inferiority, the judgment based on appearance rather than character. He looked around the cabin, making eye contact with various passengers. How many of you, he asked, saw what was happening and remained silent? How many of you witnessed injustice and did nothing? I do not blame you. It is human nature to avoid confrontation, to hope someone else will intervene. But silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of complicity. An uncomfortable shifting rippled through the cabin. People who had been passive observers of the conflict now felt the weight of their own inaction. Captain Reynolds stepped forward again. Your Excellency, I want to assure you that this passenger will be dealt with according to our policies. Such behavior is absolutely... Traoré raised a hand, stopping him. Captain, I did not reveal my identity to punish anyone. I revealed it to teach a lesson, to all of us. This woman, he gestured toward Margaret, who was still crying silently, is not evil. She is a product of a system, a worldview, that has taught her to measure human worth by external markers. She is guilty of ignorance, yes, of prejudice, certainly, but she is also capable of growth, of change, of becoming better. He moved down the aisle until he stood directly in front of Margaret's seat. She looked up at him, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face, her expensive clothing suddenly seeming like a costume, a disguise for insecurity and fear. Madame, Traoré said, his voice now gentle, almost tender, I forgive you, not because I am a president, but because I am a human being who has also made mistakes, who has also judged others unfairly at times. We all carry prejudices. We all have blind spots. The question is whether we are willing to examine them, to challenge them, to grow beyond them. Margaret's sobs intensified. I'm so ashamed, she choked out. I was so horrible to you. I said such terrible things. How can you possibly forgive me? Because forgiveness is not about what you deserve, Traoré replied. It is about what kind of person I choose to be. And I choose to believe that this moment, this painful, embarrassing, difficult moment, can be a turning point for you. You can let it crush you with shame, or you can let it transform you with wisdom. He knelt down beside her seat, bringing himself to her level, an extraordinary gesture that sent a ripple of emotion through the watching passengers. Here was a head of state, kneeling before the woman who had publicly humiliated him, offering not vengeance but compassion. Listen to me, he said quietly, speaking directly to her, but knowing his words were for everyone. You are not defined by your worst moment, but you can choose whether this moment defines your future. You can walk away from here unchanged, telling yourself that your only mistake was not knowing who I was. Or you can understand the deeper truth that you should treat every person with dignity, not because of who they might be, but simply because they are human. Margaret nodded through her tears, unable to speak, her entire body shaking with emotion. Traoré stood and addressed the cabin once more. "My friends, what happened here tonight is not unusual. It happens every day, in every corner of the world. People are judged, diminished, dismissed because of their appearance, their accent, their race, their religion. And most of the time, there is no dramatic revelation, no moment of accountability. The victim suffers in silence, and the perpetrator never learns." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But today we have been given a gift, the gift of awareness. Everyone here has witnessed something that usually remains hidden. And now you have a choice. You can return to your lives unchanged, comfortable in your assumptions and prejudices. Or you can carry this lesson forward, challenging yourself to see people not as labels or categories, but as individuals worthy of respect and dignity." A woman in the back of the cabin stood up. She was elderly, perhaps in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes. "Mr. President," she said, her voice wavering with emotion, "thank you. Thank you for teaching us. Thank you for showing us grace when you could have shown us power. You have reminded me of something I learned long ago but had forgotten. That true strength is not in dominance but in restraint." Others began to stand. First one, then two, then a dozen. And then, spontaneously, applause began. It started slow, tentative, then grew into a wave of sound that filled the cabin. People were clapping not just for Traoré, but for the lesson he had taught, for the grace he had shown, for the possibility of redemption he had offered. Traoré bowed his head slightly, accepting the applause with humility. When it subsided, he returned to his seat. "Now," he said with a slight smile, "if we could all settle down, I believe the cabin crew would like to continue their service. We have several hours left in this flight, and I, for one, could use another cup of tea." The tension broke. Laughter rippled through the cabin, not mocking laughter, but the kind that comes from relief and release. Lena, the young flight attendant who had been caught in the middle of the conflict, approached with a fresh pot of tea, her hands no longer trembling. "Your Excellency," she said softly, "thank you for being so patient with all of us. With me especially. I should have been stronger in defending you." Traoré accepted the tea with a gracious nod. "You did what you could within your constraints. Do not judge yourself too harshly, but perhaps in the future you will find more courage to speak up when you witness injustice, yes?" "Yes, sir," she whispered. "I will. I promise." As the flight continued, an extraordinary transformation took place in that cabin. Passengers who had been strangers began talking to one another, sharing their own stories of prejudice and discrimination, of times they had been judged unfairly or had judged others unjustly. Barriers of race and nationality seemed to dissolve, replaced by a shared humanity that had been made visible by one man's quiet dignity. Margaret Dunson remained in her seat, occasionally wiping her eyes, occasionally looking over at Traoré with an expression of profound remorse. Later in the flight, she would write a long letter to him, which she would deliver before they landed. In it, she would thank him for the most important lesson of her life, but that would come later. For now, the cabin settled into a peaceful rhythm, the gentle hum of engines carrying them through the night sky toward Istanbul. And Ibrahim Traoré sat by his window, looking out at the stars, knowing that something significant had occurred, not because of who he was, but because of what he had chosen to do with the power he possessed. To use it not as a weapon, but as a light. The moment the plane touched down in Istanbul, the world began to change. One of the passengers, a young Turkish graduate student named Deniz, had recorded significant portions of the confrontation on his phone. Within hours of landing, with his heart still full from witnessing what he considered a masterclass in dignity and leadership, he uploaded the video to social media with a simple caption, "White woman insults black passenger on flight. Learns he's the president of Burkina Faso. Watch how real power responds to prejudice." The video spread like wildfire. Within 6 hours, it had been viewed over 1 million times. Within 24 hours, that number had grown to 50 million. News organizations around the world picked up the story. What happened on Flight 207 became a global phenomenon. The hashtags began trending immediately. "Shut up, I am the president," "Traoré teaches dignity," "Respect has no color." On Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and every other social media platform, the video circulated with an unprecedented velocity. But unlike many viral videos that generate heat without light, this one sparked genuine conversation about racism, prejudice, and the meaning of leadership. CNN's evening broadcast led with the story. Anderson Cooper, introducing the segment, called it a moment that captures something profound about our times, how one man's dignity can illuminate the prejudices that still persist in our world. The BBC dispatched reporters to Burkina Faso to learn more about this president who flew economy, class, and responded to racism with philosophy. Their feature story, titled The President Who Flies Economy, became one of their most watched segments of the year. Al Jazeera's coverage focused on the African perspective, interviewing historians and political scientists about the significance of an African leader commanding respect not through force or wealth, but through moral authority. President Traoré has done more for Africa's image in one conversation than 1,000 diplomatic initiatives, noted Dr. Amara Kone, a professor of African Studies at the University of Dakar. But perhaps the most powerful responses came not from media outlets, but from ordinary people around the world who saw themselves in the story. In Harlem, New York, a group of African-American students organized a viewing party to watch the video together. Afterward, they marched through their neighborhood with signs reading, "Dignity is not negotiable," and "Respect every human being." One student, Marcus Williams, told a local reporter, "Seeing President Traoré stand up for himself with such grace, it reminds us that we don't have to respond to hate with hate. We can respond with truth." In Paris, where African immigrants often face discrimination, community centers began showing the video and hosting discussions. A Senegalese taxi driver named Ibrahim, sharing the president's first name by coincidence, said, "For years I have experienced what President Traoré experienced. But I never knew how to respond. He showed me that silence can be powerful, but so can speaking truth with calmness." In London, where the incident originated, a vigorous debate erupted about racism in British society. A columnist for The Guardian wrote, "Margaret Dunson's behavior on that flight was not an aberration, but a revelation of attitudes that persist beneath the surface of British politeness. We must thank President Traoré for holding up a mirror to our society." The responses were not universally positive, of course. Some critics argued that Traoré had played the race card by revealing his identity. Conservative commentators suggested that Margaret's behavior, while rude, didn't warrant the global public shaming she received, but these voices were drowned out by a tidal wave of support for Traoré and the lesson he had taught. Religious leaders from multiple faiths praised his response. Rabbi David Goldstein of New York wrote, "President Traoré embodied the teaching that when someone strikes you, you do not strike back, but neither do you cower. You stand firm in truth." Imam Mohammed al-Hassan of Cairo noted, "The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught us that the strong person is not the one who can wrestle others, but the one who controls himself in anger." President Traoré demonstrated this perfectly. Reverend Grace Thompson, a prominent African-American pastor, delivered a sermon titled "The Dignity of Restraint," which was watched online by millions. "Brothers and sisters," she preached, "we have been given a masterclass in how to respond to injustice, not with violence, not with retaliation, but with truth spoken in love. This is the power that changes hearts." While the world debated and discussed, the two main protagonists of the story underwent their own transformations. For Margaret Dunson, the aftermath was devastating. Her identity was quickly uncovered online, and within days, her life had changed completely. Her business partners distanced themselves from her. Her social media accounts were flooded with condemnation. Journalists camped outside her London home. Initially, Margaret went into hiding, refusing all comment. But after a week of reflection and consultations with a therapist and a spiritual advisor, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She reached out to President Traoré through diplomatic channels, asking permission to speak with him. To her surprise, he agreed immediately. Their conversation, conducted via video call and later shared publicly with both parties' consent, was extraordinary. Mr. President, Margaret began, her face bare of makeup, her eyes red from crying. I cannot adequately express my shame for how I treated you, but more than that, I am ashamed that it took learning you were a president for me to feel this remorse. The truth is, I would have felt justified in my behavior if you had been an ordinary person, and that realization has shattered me. Traoré listened intently, his expression compassionate. Go on, he encouraged. I have spent the last week examining my life, my beliefs, my behaviors, and what I've discovered horrifies me. I have been a racist, Mr. President, not the kind who uses slurs or joins hate groups, but the insidious kind, the kind who smiles to people's faces while judging them internally, who considers herself superior because of accidents of birth. She paused, gathering herself. I want to do better. I need to do better, not because the world is watching, but because I cannot live with who I have been. Will you help me? This request, from a woman who had humiliated him, now asking for his guidance, could have been Traoré's moment of triumph. Instead, he treated it as a sacred responsibility. Margaret, he said, using her first name, establishing human connection. The fact that you are asking this question tells me that you have already begun the journey. Change is not an event. It is a process. It requires humility, honesty, and hard work. But yes, I will help you as much as I am able. Over the following months, Margaret became an unexpected face of redemption and transformation. She sold her business and dedicated herself to anti-racism work. She founded an organization called From Prejudice to Peace, which provided education and resources for people wanting to examine and overcome their own biases. She began speaking at schools, universities, and conferences, always starting with a painful confession. My name is Margaret Dunson, and I am the woman who humiliated President Ibrahim Traoré on a flight to Istanbul. I am here to tell you that racism is not always a hood and a burning cross. Sometimes it wears expensive jewelry and flies business class. Her TEDx talk, The Day I Learned I Was Racist, was viewed over 20 million times. In it, she detailed not just the incident on the plane, but the lifetime of subtle prejudices that had led to that moment. She spoke with raw honesty about the privilege she had never acknowledged, the assumptions she had never questioned, the hurt she had caused without even realizing it. Critics accused her of profiting from her racism by becoming a public speaker. But Margaret donated every penny she earned from speaking fees to organizations combating racism and supporting education in Africa. She lived modestly, having sold her luxury apartment and moved into a simple flat. I don't deserve praise for doing what I should have been doing my whole life, she told an interviewer. President Traoré gave me a gift that day, the gift of seeing myself clearly. The least I can do is use that clarity to help others. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré returned to Burkina Faso to a hero's welcome. Thousands lined the streets of Ouagadougou, the capital, waving flags and chanting his name. But he seemed uncomfortable with the adulation. In his first address after returning home, he spoke to a packed national stadium. My dear people of Burkina Faso, my brothers and sisters across Africa and around the world, I did not do anything heroic on that airplane. I simply refuse to accept being treated as less than human. This should not be exceptional. It should be normal. Every person, regardless of their position or title, deserves basic dignity and respect. He paused, looking out over the sea of faces. But let me tell you why I chose to fly without announcement, without security, without the trappings of office. I did it because I believe that leaders must understand the lives of the people they serve. How can I make policies that affect ordinary travelers if I never experience travel as they do? How can I address discrimination if I never witness it firsthand? The crowd erupted in applause, but he raised his hand for quiet. I want to be clear about something. What happened to me happens to millions of people every single day. The only difference is that when it happened to me, I had the privilege of revealing my position and commanding respect through my title. But what about the farmer who looks like me? The teacher? The doctor? The student? They experience the same prejudice, but they have no dramatic reveal to force respect. They must simply endure. His voice grew more passionate. This is why we must build a world where respect is given freely to all people, not reserved for those with power or position. This is why we must teach our children that human dignity is not negotiable, not conditional, not dependent on external factors. He went on to announce a new initiative in Burkina Faso's schools, mandatory education on human dignity, respect, and anti-racism. We will teach our children that the color of someone's skin tells you nothing about their character, their intelligence, or their worth. We will teach them that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in uplifting them. The speech was broadcast globally and became a defining moment in Traoré's presidency. But for him, it was simply an extension of values he had held his entire life. 6 months after the incident, Ibrahim Traoré was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly. The invitation came from the Secretary General himself, who wrote, "Your Excellency, your response to prejudice demonstrated a form of leadership that the world desperately needs to witness and emulate." The General Assembly Hall was packed on the day of his speech. Delegates from 193 nations filled the seats. Journalists from around the world positioned their cameras. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. When Traoré took the podium, he wore the same simple khaki shirt he had worn on the plane, a deliberate choice that did not go unnoticed. Distinguished delegates, "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but carrying easily through the vast space. "I stand before you today not as a president, but as a witness to the persistent disease of prejudice that infects our world, a witness to the suffering it causes, and a witness to the possibility of healing." He recounted the incident on the plane, not as an accusation, but as an illustration of a larger truth. "When that woman judged me by my appearance, she was not acting alone. She was acting on behalf of centuries of conditioning, of systems designed to create hierarchies among human beings. She believed, consciously or unconsciously, that some people deserve respect and others must earn it, that some lives matter more than others, that some humans are more human than others." The hall was silent, every person present understanding that this was no ordinary diplomatic speech. But here is what I learned on that airplane, and what I want to share with this august body. The greatest power we possess is not military might or economic strength. It is the power to choose how we respond to injustice. We can respond with violence, with bitterness, with revenge, or we can respond with truth, with dignity, with an appeal to the better angels of human nature. He looked around the room, making eye contact with delegates from different regions and cultures. I could have used my position to humiliate that woman, to have her removed from the plane, to make her suffer consequences. But what would that have taught anyone? It would have taught that power grants the right to retaliate. That might makes right that the response to disrespect is punishment. He paused, letting the silence amplify his next words. Instead, I chose a different path. I chose to show her, and through her, the world, that dignity cannot be taken from us unless we surrender it. That respect, when freely given, is more powerful than respect demanded. That the measure of a person is not in how they respond when everyone is watching, but in how they conduct themselves when they believe no one will hold them accountable. The speech continued for 30 minutes, during which Traoré outlined a vision for global cooperation based on fundamental human dignity. He proposed a new international covenant, the Global Charter of Respect, which would commit signatory nations to active anti-discrimination policies in education. "We talk endlessly about human rights," he said. "But what about human respect? We can legislate rights, but respect must be cultivated in the human heart. It must be taught to children, modeled by leaders, and expected in every interaction between human beings." When he concluded, the General Assembly rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, took the podium with visible emotion. "Your Excellency, you have reminded us why we built this institution, not merely to prevent war, but to promote the conditions that make peace possible. And there can be no peace without dignity, no dignity without respect, and no respect without recognizing our common humanity." That day, 157 nations signed a preliminary agreement to develop the Global Charter of Respect. It was unprecedented, an international commitment driven not by crisis but by inspiration, not by fear, but by hope. The most remarkable outcome of the airplane incident was entirely grassroots, the establishment of World Dignity Day. It began with students. At universities across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas, young people organized gatherings on the anniversary of the flight incident, October 20th. They called it Dignity Day, a day to reflect on how they treated others and how they wanted to be treated. In Ghana, students held a Walk of Respect, where thousands marched through Accra, wearing shirts with Traoré's words, "If you want peace in the world, start by respecting every human being." In France, schools organized dignity dialogues, where students shared experiences of discrimination and discussed concrete ways to combat prejudice. In the United States, community organizations created respect pledges that individuals and businesses could sign, committing to active anti-racism and inclusive practices. The movement spread organically, without central organization or coordination. It was as if the world had been waiting for permission to have these conversations, and Traoré's example had opened the door. Social media filled with personal stories. People shared times they had been discriminated against and times they had discriminated against others. The hashtag #MyDignityStory trended globally, creating a tapestry of human experience that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. A particular sub-movement emerged called the empty chair. Restaurants, offices, and public spaces would place an empty chair with a sign reading, "This chair is reserved for dignity. If you see someone being treated disrespectfully, offer them this chair and let them know they matter." The symbolism was powerful, and the practice spread rapidly. Businesses found that the empty chair served as a constant reminder to employees and customers alike that respect was not optional, but essential. Celebrities and influencers joined the movement. Beyoncé released a song called Dignity, with all proceeds going to anti-racism education. The song's chorus, simple but powerful, became an anthem. "Don't judge me by my skin. Don't measure me by where I've been. See the human that I am within. Dignity is where we begin." Athletes wore "Respect Has No Color" armbands during international competitions. A famous football match between France and Senegal began with both teams kneeling together, not in protest, but in solidarity, honoring the principle that every person deserves dignity. Even corporations got involved, though sometimes cynically trying to capitalize on the movement. But the public was discerning, calling out dignity washing, companies that claimed to support the movement while maintaining discriminatory practices. This accountability helped ensure that the movement retained its authenticity. 2 years after the incident, as World Dignity Day became an established global observance, Ibrahim Traoré wrote an open letter that was published simultaneously in newspapers around the world. It began, "Dear fellow citizens of Earth, 2 years ago I experienced something that millions of people experience regularly. I was judged and found wanting based on my appearance. The difference was that I had the platform to transform that moment of discrimination into a moment of education. But I write to you today with a concern. I worry that the lesson has been misunderstood. The point was never that people should respect me because I am a president. The point was that people should respect each other because we are human beings." He went on to address what he saw as a troubling trend: people using the incident as a weapon to shame others rather than as a tool for growth and understanding. When someone makes a mistake born of prejudice, we have a choice. We can destroy them with our condemnation, driving them deeper into defensiveness and denial, or we can offer them the possibility of redemption through education and transformation. I chose the latter with Margaret Dunson, and I have watched her become one of the most effective advocates for dignity and respect in the world today. The letter outlined specific practices that individuals, communities, and nations could adopt to promote dignity. For individuals, practice self-examination. Regularly question your own assumptions and biases. Speak up. When you witness disrespect, intervene with calm but firm clarity. Listen deeply, especially to people whose experiences differ from your own model respect. Treat service workers, strangers, and those with less power with the same courtesy you show to those with authority. For communities, create spaces for difficult conversations about race. Class and privilege celebrate diversity not as tolerance but as enrichment. Hold institutions accountable for discriminatory practices. Support organizations working for equity and justice for nations. Implement comprehensive anti-bias education in schools. Reform systems that perpetuate inequality. Measure national success not just by GDP but by dignity indicators. How? Well, the most vulnerable are treated. Lead by example at the highest levels of government. The letter concluded with words that would be carved into monuments and memorized by school children. Dignity is not a luxury to be enjoyed by the privileged. It is a birthright of every human being. When we deny dignity to others, we diminish ourselves. When we honor the dignity of others, we elevate all of humanity. This is not idealism. It is the most practical wisdom we can embrace. For in a world where every person is treated with respect, war becomes unthinkable, injustice becomes intolerable, and our shared potential becomes unlimited. Choose dignity, not just today but every day. Not just for those who look like you, speak like you, or believe like you, but for every human being without exception. This is the revolution our world needs, not a revolution of violence, but a revolution of respect, with hope and determination. Ibrahim Traoré. 5 years after the incident, Ibrahim Traoré's presidency ended. He chose not to seek re-election, believing that true democracy required the regular transition of power. His farewell address to the nation of Burkina Faso was characteristically humble. "I have been honored to serve as your president," he said, "but I am most proud not of any policy I implemented or any law I signed, but of a conversation I had on an airplane. Because that conversation, witnessed by the world, helped shift our collective understanding of what leadership means." He outlined what he saw as the new paradigm. Leadership is not about power over others, but power with others. It is not about being served, but about serving. It is not about demanding respect, but about giving it freely and watching it multiply. Research institutions began studying what became known as the Traoré effect, measurable changes in social attitudes and behaviors that could be traced back to the airplane incident and its aftermath. Studies found a 34% increase in reporting of discrimination in countries that had adopted Dignity Day programs. Not because discrimination increased, but because people felt empowered to speak up. 28% improvement in workplace diversity initiatives at companies that implemented dignity training. Significant reduction in bullying at schools that incorporated dignity education into their curricula. Improved diplomatic relations between nations that had signed the Global Charter of Respect. But perhaps the most powerful testament to Traoré's impact came not from statistics, but from stories. A young girl in Brazil, bullied for her dark skin, found courage by watching the video of Traoré's calm dignity in the face of disrespect. A businessman in Japan, who had always dismissed his company's cleaning staff without acknowledgement, began greeting them by name and thanking them for their work. A police officer in the United States, trained to see young black men as threats, started questioning his assumptions and treating every person he encountered as someone's beloved child. A teacher in India, who had unconsciously favored students from higher castes, restructured her classroom to ensure equal attention and respect for all students. These millions of small transformations, rippling outward from a single incident on a single flight, represented something unprecedented, a global shift in consciousness initiated not by law or force, but by example. In his retirement, Ibrahim Traoré remained active but in a different capacity. He founded the Institute for Human Dignity in Ouagadougou, which became a global center for research, education, and advocacy. He also traveled extensively, though always simply off in economy class, though airlines, after the incident, frequently upgraded him, much to his amusement. He visited schools, spoke at universities, met with community groups, and engaged in countless conversations about dignity, respect, and the possibility of a better world. One particular visit captured the essence of his philosophy. He traveled to London, the city where his transformative journey had begun, to speak at a school in a disadvantaged neighborhood with high rates of racial tension. The students, mostly teenagers, were skeptical. They had experienced so much discrimination and disrespect that they doubted any speech could make a difference. Traoré didn't give them a speech. Instead, he sat in a circle with them and asked them to share their experiences. For 2 hours, he simply listened. He heard about racial profiling by police, about teachers who had lower expectations for students of color, about classmates who made racist jokes, about parents working multiple jobs for poverty wages while being treated as invisible by the wealthy people they served. When they finished, there was a heavy silence. These young people had poured out their pain, and now they waited, expecting platitudes or empty promises. Traoré spoke quietly. "Everything you have shared with me is real. Your pain is valid. Your anger is justified. And anyone who tells you to simply ignore discrimination or rise above it does not understand the weight you carry every day." The students leaned forward, surprised. "But I want to share something with you. When that woman disrespected me on the airplane, I had a choice. I could have let her disrespect define me, make me small, make me bitter. Or I could have let it reveal her while I remained who I chose to be. I chose dignity not because she deserved my grace, but because I deserved to maintain my integrity." He looked around the circle. "You will face many Margaret Dunsons in your life. Some will be obvious in their prejudice. Others will be subtle. But here is what I want you to understand. Their disrespect is their problem, not yours. The moment you let their prejudice change who you are, they have won. But when you maintain your dignity in the face of disrespect, when you refuse to shrink yourself to fit their narrow expectations, you have already won." A girl raised her hand. "But Mr. President, you could reveal who you were and force her to respect you." "We don't have that power. We're just kids from a poor neighborhood. Nobody cares about respecting us." Traoré smiled gently. "You have the same power I have, the power to know your own worth regardless of whether others acknowledge it. Let me tell you a secret. I knew who I was before I showed that passport. My dignity didn't come from my title. My title came from my dignity. I became a leader because I first learned to lead myself, to conduct myself with honor even when no one was watching, to treat others with respect even when they didn't respect me, to stand firm in my values even when it was difficult," he continued. "Every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. The teacher who seems harsh may be dealing with personal tragedy. The police officer who is aggressive may be operating from fear and inadequate training. The classmate who makes racist jokes may be repeating what they learned at home without questioning it. This doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps you understand that their actions are about them, not about you." "So what do we do?" the boy asked. "Just accept being disrespected?" "No," Traoré said firmly. "Never accept disrespect, but respond to it strategically. Sometimes you speak up in the moment. Sometimes you report it through proper channels. Sometimes you use the experience to fuel your determination to succeed and prove stereotypes wrong. And sometimes, the most powerful response is to carry yourself with such consistent dignity that people are forced to reconsider their assumptions." The conversation continued for another hour. By the end, something had shifted in that room. These young people still faced the same challenges, the same discrimination, the same systemic barriers. But they had been given something precious: permission to value themselves, strategies for maintaining dignity in difficult circumstances, and hope that change was possible. As Traoré left the school, a teacher approached him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "These students have been so beaten down by life." "You gave them something to stand on." "No," Traoré replied. "They already had something to stand on, their inherent worth as human beings. I simply reminded them of what was already there." 10 years after the airplane incident, a remarkable ceremony took place at the United Nations. The General Assembly voted unanimously to establish a permanent memorial called the Empty Seat of Dignity. A single chair, modest, unadorned, identical to the ones used in the General Assembly, was placed in the entrance hall of the UN building. A plaque beside it read, This empty seat represents every person who has been denied their rightful place due to prejudice, discrimination, or disrespect. It stands as a reminder that until every human being is treated with dignity, there is work left to do, and it waits for the day when it can finally be filled, not by any particular person, but by the spirit of universal respect that humanity has achieved. Ibrahim Traoré was invited to the unveiling ceremony. Now in his 70s, his hair completely gray, his face lined with age, he moved slowly but with the same quiet dignity that had defined his life. When asked to speak, he stood before the empty seat for a long moment before addressing the gathered crowd. This chair is empty, but it is not waiting to be filled by me or by any individual. It is waiting to be filled by all of us, by our collective commitment to treating every person with the respect they deserve. It will remain empty as long as prejudice remains in human hearts. But every time someone chooses dignity over discrimination, every time someone speaks up against injustice, every time someone treats another human being with respect regardless of their race, religion, class, or nationality, this chair becomes a little less empty. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the audience. I am an old man now. I will not live to see this chair filled. But I have hope that your children, or their children, will live in a world where this memorial is no longer necessary, where treating every person with dignity is so natural, so automatic, that we cannot imagine it being any other way. That is the world I worked for. That is the world I dreamed of when I sat on that airplane, being judged for my appearance but knowing my worth. And that is the world I encourage each of you to build, one interaction, one choice, one moment of respect at a time. The ceremony concluded with a minute of silence, during which every person present was invited to reflect on how they treated others and how they wanted to be treated. As people filed past the empty seat, many paused to touch it, to reflect, to make silent commitments to themselves. The seat became one of the most photographed and visited locations in New York, a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand and embody the principle of human dignity. Ibrahim Traoré lived to the age of 87. When he passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family, the world mourned. But it was not the mourning of despair. It was the mourning of gratitude for a life well lived, a lesson well taught, a legacy well established. His funeral in Ouagadougou drew leaders from around the world. But what moved observers most were the ordinary people who lined the streets, millions of them, holding signs that read, "Thank you for teaching us dignity. You showed us how to be human. Your lesson lives on." Margaret Dunson, now in her 70s herself, attended the funeral. She laid a single white rose at his casket with a note that read, "Thank you for saving my life by showing me who I had become and who I could be." In the years that followed, Dignity Day continued to grow. It became a global observance officially recognized by the United Nations, celebrated in schools, workplaces, and communities worldwide. On October 20th each year, billions of people took time to reflect on how they could treat others with greater respect. Research showed that the generation of children who grew up learning about Ibrahim Traoré and the principles of human dignity showed significantly lower rates of prejudice, higher rates of empathy, and greater likelihood of intervening when they witnessed injustice. The airplane where the original incident occurred was eventually retired from service. It was purchased by the Institute for Human Dignity and converted into a traveling museum. The exact seat where Traoré had sat was preserved, and visitors could sit there, watch the video of what had transpired, and reflect on what it meant. Beside the seat, a quotation was inscribed, the words that had defined Ibrahim Traoré's philosophy and inspired a global movement. If you want peace in the world, start by respecting every human being. Dignity is not negotiable, not conditional, not dependent on title or wealth or race. It is the birthright of every person who draws breath. When we honor this truth, we honor the sacred in ourselves and others. This is not just a moral imperative. It is the foundation of everything good we hope to build in this world. And in airports around the world, in business class and economy, in first class and the back row, people who had heard the story thought twice before judging the person next to them. They looked beyond appearances. They offered kindness to strangers. They recognized the humanity in every face, because one man, on one night, on one flight, had shown the world that true power lies not in dominance but in dignity, not in retaliation but in respect, not in the throne you occupy but in the character you embody. The empty seat at the United Nations still stands, waiting. But with each passing year, as more people embrace the lesson Ibrahim Traoré taught, it becomes a little less empty. And someday, perhaps not soon, but someday it will be filled, not by a person, but by a reality, a world where every human being is treated with the dignity they deserve. That day, Ibrahim Traoré's true legacy will be complete. The end.